In this video, I want to go over motion blur and frame rates. And I know that in the previous lessons, we talked about the 180-degree shutter rule and that it gives you natural motion blur. And for the most part, this is correct. But this may not be the way to go for higher frame rates like 50 or 60 or 120 FPS. First off, let me say that if you're shooting in 24, 25 or 30 frames per second, then yes, make your shutter speed twice your frame rate. The issue that can come up is when you start choosing a higher frame rate like 50 or 60p or 120. Let's explain. Motion blur is determined by the shutter speed alone and not the frame rate. If we look at these two shots, we can see that the shot at 24 frames per second and the other at 60 frames per second both have the same shutter speed. And if we pause the video, we can see that the motion blur looks the same, showing that the shutter speed alone affects the blur. And timeline doesn't matter also, i.e. if you have a 24 frames per second timeline and play back at 24 frames per second, or you shoot at 60 frames per second and play back at 60 frames per second. The motion blur is the same if the shutter speed is the same. Next, if you're going to slow down the footage later on in post, then yes, keep the 180-degree shutter rule even if you're doing 60 or 120 frames per second, and slowing it down later on in post for delivery. In reality, we know that if we stick to the 180-degree rule at a higher frame rate without slowing it down, you'll get much less motion blur. Looking at these two shots, we see that following the 180-degree rule with 120p, we get much less motion blur. So the consensus is, if you're shooting in a higher frame rate, like 50 or 60p, and you're going to deliver it in 50 or 60p in a timeline, or you're going to place it into a 24, 25 or 30p timeline and drop frames, then your shutter speed needs to be the same as your frame rate, i.e. 360 degrees. So for 60 frames per second, set the shutter speed for 1/60. For 50 SPS, set the shutter speed for 1/50. And for 120 frames per second, set the shutter speed for 1/120. Because as we've seen, shooting in 60p with a shutter at 1/120, i.e. the 180-degree rule, and you want to play it back at normal speed, will get less motion blur. But why would you want to deliver in 50p or 60p anyway? Well, people that do events and weddings, for example, they don't know that they might want to get that slow motion moment. So they could shoot at, let's say, 60 frames per second with a shutter at 1/60. And if they deliver the footage on 30p timeline, for example, every other frame will be dropped and we'll still get a natural motion blur. But they also have the ability to slow down the 60p footage to half speed if they want to get that slow motion moment. So in summary, if you're shooting at 24, 25 or 30 frames per second, use the 180-degree shutter rule. If you're shooting at a higher frame rate, like 50, 60 or 120, with the intention of slowing it down later on in post, also use the 180-degree shutter rule. However, if you don't know if you're going to slow it down in post or not, you're better off shooting at 50 or 60p and having your shutter at 1/50 or 1/60. But in reality, opinions differ with the last point, and it's a matter of taste. So try it out for yourself. For higher frame rates, do some tests using the 180-degree shutter rule, and then shoot the same footage using the 360-degree rule and see which one you like best. And once again, it's a matter of taste. Some people like the high frame rates with 180 degrees, and some people like the more motion blur using the 360. So do some tests of your own and see what you come up with. All right, let's move on to the next lesson.